The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, we're picking up the discussion on debt in part because from our last conversation that we had with Yinka Adegoke from Quartz, we determined that debt really is going to be one of the key issues between now and the end of the year. Lots of new developments came out over the past few days. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, and Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, all three this week gave impassioned pleas for the international community to once again get engaged in the debt relief issue. Now, these are the same pleas that they've been making going back all the way to March. In fact, March 23rd is when Prime Minister Abiy really made the first plea and appeal for African debt relief. Since then, there's been some progress on the G20's debt service suspension initiative. There's also been some progress at the IMF and the World Bank. We've seen some hints of progress with the Chinese, but all in all, based on the intensity of the appeals coming from these African leaders, there really hasn't been enough. Now, let's go through what they're asking for. For the most part, here's a summary of what they're asking for. They want to extend the G20's DSSI, that's the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, through 2021. So that would give a holiday to pay back interest on their debt. They also want to provide an immediate cash injection of between $100 and $150 billion to assist African economies facing liquidity challenges. That is a chronic problem now in many African countries. They also want the International Monetary Fund to issue special drawing rights that would provide an additional capital injection to the world's poorest countries. And they're also calling for debt cancellation, very different than the debt restructuring. Two new developments this week from Zambia and Angola, and that's what's going to be the focus of our conversation today. Just a week after Angola reached a debt restructuring deal, both with the IMF and with China, there are now new doubts emerging over the government's ability to service its debts, even beyond the payment holidays that it's received, based in part on a report that revealed the state-owned oil giant Sonangol, in their 2019 debt repayments, they exceeded the core profits of the company. So what that means is if Sonangol cannot generate enough profit to pay back the debts, then where is that money going to come from? So now all of a sudden investors are starting to get more concerned that the debt restructuring deal may not be as exciting as they first thought. Finally, also in Zambia, the finance minister tried to reassure the international financial community with an announcement that he wants to try and reach a restructuring deal with creditors within 6 months. And what he's trying to do is tamp out the flames that are burning up Zambia's credit rating and their credibility. Within 24 hours of Zambia defaulting on 3 Eurobond notes worth about $3 billion, Fitch Ratings downgraded the country's credit rating. That is going to make it much more expensive in the future for Zambia to borrow. And at the same time, this is a warning that other countries may follow Zambia's lead right now in defaulting on some or all of their debts. Cobus, you've been writing about this. You had an article that came out this week in Business Day Live that talked about China's role in all of this.
I drew the parallel between the situation in Zambia and other ones that are emerging in other African countries, and a situation in Laos, which we've discussed before. Kind of where they ended up doing a kind of a debt for equity swap deal, which saved Laos from default on commercial debt, but at the same time essentially put a Chinese company in control of Laos's national power grid. So I made the point that even though this kind of deal will to my mind lead to this kind of firestorm of controversy, I think in in any African country, if it goes through in any African country, it might end up actually being the more attractive deal for African governments, because they might find some kind of negotiation space with the Chinese to save to save some political capital at home, and at the same time they will avoid default. But kind of that will then really I think kind of up the stakes in terms of the political relationship between China and African governments.
Now, given China's outsized role in Africa's debt situation in the crisis right now, there's been a lot of attention on what China's doing or not doing, for that matter. There's been a lot of criticism from the G7 as well as World Bank President David Malpass. But today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what private creditors are doing and look at the whole picture of the debt situation. And we want to get the perspective of asset managers and those private creditors and bondholders. And for that, we're so honored to have on the show for the first time Mark Bohlund, who's a senior credit research analyst at Red Intelligence. For those of you not familiar with Red, it's a risk assessment service for asset managers. Just so you know that Mark has an extensive background in African debt issues. Before he joined Red, he was an Africa and Middle East economist at Bloomberg, and prior to that, he was a senior economist at IHS Global Insight. Mark, thank you so much for joining us from London. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
You have been following the situation in Angola. We're going to go through a couple of the different countries one by one. Let's start with Angola. Tell us what we need to know about what happened in Angola and what we still don't know.
Well, it depends on how far you want to go back. But I mean, Angola was one of the countries that borrowed heaviest from China. I mean, I described a kind of modern engagement between China and Africa as having, the three stages, early stages when, China in the 2000, when the oil price was just continuing to climb, and China was very concerned if they could keep this sort of Chinese economy going, because they were paying more and more for the oil price, and they were importing more and more oil, and was seeking all around the world to essentially source this oil. And that's why it got into a lot of debt, where they lent money to places like Venezuela, Angola, Sudan, and this was backed by oil deliveries, and they had an escrow account where they would finance infrastructure projects in Angola, and then it would be gradually paid off by oil deliveries, oil shipments, and it would be tagged to the spot oil price. And that's the situation in Angola. It is quite a messy situation where you had different banks lending, but the biggest, the most significant lenders in Angola is China Development Bank and China Exim Bank. And what makes Angola unique, fairly unique when it comes to Africa, is the big lending from China Development Bank, which has a quite sort of interesting history, which I'm sure you've covered in previous podcasts.
What about the debt restructuring deal that just happened? I know you've been commenting quite a bit on Twitter about that, and with the IMF and the Chinese. And was that a really as significant as everybody thought it was? Because it was the first time that we've seen a major Chinese debt restructuring deal in Africa so far.
Well, I would say it's definitely significant, but I think it's yet a deal. It's still to be finalized. As you know, the IMF report was initially to be discussed on July 30th, but then that was postponed until after the summer recess. And if you look at that report that was to be published in late July, early August, after that meeting, the wording is very similar to what you have in the actual report that were released was it last week, just about a week or so, and he's still talking about they're finalizing an agreement, and I think it's quite clear that the parties are further away than is actually implied in this wording, that the negotiations are still ongoing. I mean, that's what we saw. We had a statement from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman that these negotiations are still ongoing and progress is being made. But there's still a deal. The deal is still to be made. And I think it could be a couple of weeks before we actually see an official announcement. It could drag out even further.
How do you see this new report about the profitability of Sonangol impacting on this deal?
Well, this is it's the debt of the government that is negotiated. Consider this. So, of course, the Sonangol I don't think it directly affects the deal. What you had was quite a complex arrangement where China Development Bank lent billions to Sonangol. And then Sonangol, after the drop in the oil price in 2014, Sonangol wasn't making money and couldn't really service their debts. So what CDB did, China Development Bank, was they initiated this credit line. It was as big as $15 billion. I'm not sure, it's still not clear exactly how much of that was actually drawn upon, but the government drew on that money to recapitalize Sonangol and paying back the loans from China. So the debt from China Development Bank now is actually to the Angolan government rather than Sonangol. So I don't think it affects the deal directly. And of course, the links between Sonangol and Angolan government are pretty complex. I mean, it was seen as a kind of a center of excellence there. One of the few parts of the Angolan governments that could actually get things done, and that's why it took on a lot of operations that are normally done by the government. That's why the IMF came up with this term, the quasi-fiscal operations of the Sonangol, essentially paying for fuel subsidies and other things that essentially different government departments should be doing.
Help us understand something, because there's a very important point of contention between China and the G7 finance ministers, some of the G20 countries, about the role of China Development Bank, what's classified as commercial debt, what's classified as a debt from a policy bank, and how those fold into the DSSI. And that's a very big kind of point of issue among all these different players. David Malpass, the World Bank president, has criticized China for complicating and muddying the water, particularly around China Development Bank. Can you help us understand what that issue is about?
Yes, I mean, I think it goes back to, there is no China Inc. There's not one body. There are definitely different bodies that have operated. You have, the policy banks involved, and China Exim Bank is kind of a traditional sort of expert supporting agency, and it's quite clear that that is included in the DSSI. But China Development Bank, I mean, from the name, you'd think it's pretty clear that it is a policy bank, and I mean it's how it operated, set up in 1994 to support sort of government projects in China, and then it started lending outside of China, in Africa, and other places in the mid-2000s. And this operation with Sonangol is a pretty complicated operation. And China Development Bank also came in to kind of take over loans from other Chinese banks that had lent to Angola in order, this program to secure the oil deliveries. So, China Development Bank was officially, well, if I'm not mistaken, it was kind of restructured as a commercial bank in December 2008. And in contrast to China Exim Bank, has lent to not only to governments, but also to private companies, and Sonangol being the foremost of those, and also at commercial rates, while China Exim Bank has generally lent at more concessional rates. Chinese policy banks have generally lent at slightly higher rates than the World Bank and other multilateral institutions, but far lower than the commercial creditors. So, this is a very kind of tangled situation, which China has been trying to kind of tidy up in the last few years. You had the China FOCAC, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, in 2018, where they made clear that there would be a clearer separation between this commercial lending and the concessional lending. And it's really tidying up that, clearing out all the sort of crossed lines that is essentially what is going on now, and why China is in the situation it is in regards to Africa.
If we step back a little from the Angolan situation, I suppose one of the big differences between the previous bout of debt cancellation that we saw in the 2000s and the current debt crisis in Africa now is that commercial and Eurobond debt is making up so much bigger a proportion of the debt in question. So how do kind of private creditors see the current calls coming from people like Cyril Ramaphosa and Uhuru Kenyatta for these kind of large pauses in repayment and large kind of even cancellation of debt? How is that discussed in private creditor circles?
Yes, I mean, you're correct that, in contrast to the previous debt crisis, 80s, 90s, it's a lot more dispersed creditor landscape, both when it comes to sort of the bilateral, where, of course, China is now the biggest bilateral creditor, and a lot of the sort of Western and sort of Japan they've lent a lot through UN and the World Bank, rather, UN institutions and other development banks. So their bilateral debt is actually quite small, and their contribution to the DSSI that is also that. And you've also seen a shift in the private sector. Private creditor landscape, where previously it was largely banks lending to these countries, both in U.S. banks, Latin America, and I guess in Africa would be more commercial European banks. And now you have, since the 2007, you had initial sort of tentative entry into the Eurobond market with Ghana, and then you had the global financial crisis. You had a sort of temporary pause, and it started again in 2010, 2011, really in earnest, and then it's really ramped up. So you have a lot more dispersed creditor landscape. And as I mentioned in the DSI report I published in September 11, which I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested, I think that two main consequences of this is, I think it's, coordination is going to be very much more difficult, because these asset managers, they don't they don't invest on their own behalf, as Esan Irandust, sorry if I mispronounced the name, wrote in the letter to a China Africa project blog, which I thought was very good. It's actually money invested on behalf of their investors. And this is a very dispersed landscape, and it's, I think it was clear from the beginning of the DSSI that it would be virtually impossible to coordinate, to get this, necessary coordination to actually have any private sector involvement in the DSSI. And I think, everyone kind of realized quite soon that there wouldn't be any voluntary private sector involvement in the DSSI. And I think that will be the case, even if it is extended into 2021, as is being discussed and suggested by the G7 ahead of the G20 meeting. But it also means, which I think is just as important, that eventual credit losses will be a lot more dispersed. You won't have this kind of large debt exposures to developing countries undermining the solvency of the banking sector in the credit countries, as was the case in the US in the 1980s. And of course, I shouldn't call Greece a developing country, although I think some categorize it as developing countries in some bond indices or whatever they are. But I mean, that was also the question to the Greek debt crisis. They couldn't write off this debt without blowing big holes in the balance sheet of very large European banks. But with the African Eurobond debt being the holdings being so dispersed, that is not a problem when it comes to writing off the commercial debt or the Eurobond debt in Eurobond debt for African countries. And I don't think China and the G7 are that far apart on that point. But whether that is actually being fully priced in, I don't think that is fully priced into the Eurobond market. And I think it is a risk, or there's quite a high probability that it will be priced in, resulting in spikes in Eurobond yields for a lot of these African sovereign bond issues over the next few months. as this kind of framework becomes clear in the G20 meeting in November, and you have the sort of finance minister and central bank meeting for the G20 is in 2 weeks' time, at about the same time as the IMF and the fall meeting. So it's going to be very interesting times ahead.
Well, there's a lot of tension right now in the market, in part because there is the policy side of the equation, which seems to be very angry with the private creditor side of the equation. So David Malpass, once again, the president of the World Bank, a couple weeks ago said, and I quote here, "Commercial creditors as a group need to look to the longer run. These countries are a potential source of future income, and the right thing is to look to debt relief. I'm frustrated that commercial creditors have been continuing to take very large payments from the poorest countries." We've also seen frustration from NGOs, the Jubilee Debt Campaign. Lots of stakeholders in Africa have also been calling for debt relief. That letter that you referred to the China-Africa Project, which was excellent, I'll put it in the show notes, and it was really in defense of private creditors, because I was also very critical about this group called the Private Creditor Working Group, which was supposedly set up I think with 25 different asset management firms, and they were going to reportedly negotiate settlements. Well, they haven't done anything, so I called it a joke. And then this reader of ours, in our subscriber to our newsletter, he responded and he said, "I wanted to say that while I completely understand the notion of painting bondholders as part of the African debt relief problem, I think the tendency to vilify our industry is misplaced and overly simplistic." Now, you work in that side of the industry here. When you see the criticisms coming from the likes of David Malpass and listening to scholars and academics and other various stakeholders who say they should cancel the debt or do something, it runs right up against the fiduciary responsibilities that many of these asset management firms have. They literally cannot actually cancel the debt, legally speaking. They're bound to actually pursue a repayment. And talk to us a little bit about that conflict that's there.
Yeah, I think it's very clear. I mean, you would, as an asset manager, you have the fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of your clients. So in order to come to an agreement, you would essentially have to contact every client of yours, everyone who's invested in this fund. And I mean, if you add to that, now a lot of money is from exchange traded funds. I mean, it's very difficult to actually find out who are the bondholders, and then you'd have to get them all to agree, and then you'd have to get all the other asset managers, all the other sort of private banks and whatever people who are invested in these bonds, and get them all to agree to similar terms. You get all this sort of trading companies and all that, and I mean, I think it's a virtually impossible.
It's impossible.
Yes,
but also some of the investors are also pension funds, retirees, teachers, firemen, whatnot, too. And there's a moral issue here that they can't stand to lose their money either. They're depending on the returns from these investments in order to sustain retirements and pensions.
Yes, I mean, that's what you've seen, that with, the sort of traditional, the interest rates on the traditional instruments that, pension funds are invested in, so UK gilts, government bonds from developed countries like the UK, the US, Germany. A lot of them are now in negative territory, so you're actually paying to hold them, paying for the benefit of holding a safe security where you won't have to worry about default. So of course, that has pushed this money into riskier assets. And I think it's quite clear from the beginning that there would be defaults. I mean, and in theory, it's a match made in heaven. You have these sort of African countries that need to invest in infrastructure, things that will give a return, but probably only on 10, 20, 30 years, which is also the sort of time horizon that, people are investing in if they're saving in their pensions and they're in their 30s, 40s. So in theory, it's a match made in heaven, but I think it was always clear that, it would end in tears for quite a few countries. And if you look at the comments, I mean, I think that is kind of a bit of a taboo topic or a statement among these asset managers to say that, they will admit that there will be private sector involvement in these, that there will be defaults and that there will be private sector involvement in this. I mean, some just seem to think that China will write off all their debts, and Charlie Robertson thinking, everyone else has got a bailout, so these people are investing in in African countries, investing, development in these countries should also get a bailout. But I think that is, I think I don't know if it's just kind of make believe, or if I think it's just very difficult to say, admit that they're going to be private sector involvement in these countries, just because, you're going to risk inflows into your fund, and that you're not acting in the best interest of your clients.
So Eric mentioned, that Zambia is currently, trying to negotiate a deal with the IMF, and they're probably quite ambitious in terms of wanting to kind of negotiate a deal like that in a few months. I read somewhere that kind of the restructuring of Mozambican kind of bond debt took 3 years to negotiate. So so in that case, so say the Zambian negotiation fails, and it isn't possible to negotiate that kind of deal with the IMF. What happens then? Like, are we talking private creditors suing the Zambian government, or what kind of tools are then open to these private creditors?
Yes, to make clear, so Zambia has not defaulted yet. So what they've done is asked for a standstill payment from a standstill agreement, a 6-month one running from 14th of October to April 14th next year, where they're essentially not going to pay the interest payments on both their Eurobonds, and they're looking to do a similar treatment for the private sector debt, debt to commercial creditors. And our understanding is that so the Eurobond holders will have to vote on this. They need a majority of 75% across the 3 bonds that they have issued to agree to this. And our understanding is that the bondholders are not happy with this, that they will not agree to this standstill agreement. And then if Zambia does not pay, it has an upcoming Eurobond payments in October. They don't pay that, then they will be officially in default. And so I think this kind of the whole plan is fairly quite ambitious, and it's not going to succeed in getting the standstill agreement. But I mean, the Zambian hope was that they would get a IMF agreement by the end of this standstill agreement in Q2 next year. Because it's one of the few countries in Africa that has not received any IMF help at all, just because the IMF essentially does not view that their debt as being sustainable. So the Zambian, what they're trying to do is essentially negotiate with their debt holders to make the debt sustainable and get some IMF support, IMF funds. And so that's the Zambian plan.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa, or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
Zambia is one situation where there's a lot of concern. Fitch Ratings immediately after did initiate a downgrade of 4. So it may not be an official default, but already in the eyes of at least the credit ratings agencies it is. Moody's is sounding the warning now on Mozambique. There are concerns about South Africa's stability. So when you look at the continent as a whole right now, and we see, again, in the context of these appeals that keep coming from the major African countries' leaders, what's your forecast looking forward for the next 3 to 6 months as we enter into this very, very complicated phase of the economic crisis?
Yeah, I think it's going to be complicated. I think, that's the main word. But I definitely think it's going to be in the highlights during you have the IMF fall meeting coming up in 2 weeks' time. You have the G20 summit in November. And I think, getting Angola out of the picture, I think, will help things, but you're still going to have this kind of clash. I mean, Africa and other developing countries are essentially caught in this clash, primarily between China and the US, but also, the wider G7, G20 is, Africa is going to need substantial financial help, and who's going to finance that bill? I mean, it's quite clear the U.S. and Japan says it's China. They've lent all this money recklessly, and they need to kind of step up and pay their fair share and help out these countries that they've lent so freely to. While China says, hey, this DSSI is, I mean, almost all of it is Chinese debt. I mean, it's I think around 2/3 of the sum of the actual the debt that's going to be deferred, not forgiven. So will have to be, well, in theory, repaid at a later point, is actually from China. So I mean, when you say that, when the Japanese finance minister Taro Aso said, China needs to pay its fair share, he's not really taking into account that, DSSI, the contribution from China to that is 10 times the sum of Japan for the May to December period, and that's, not considering that Japan is a very much richer country per capita than China. So it's essentially finding sort of an equitable solution to who's going to help out these, or how are sort of the developed countries going to come together to help to give these African countries the financial support they need.
If there is a series of defaults, running across Africa, and if private creditors are involved, where does that leave the private creditors? Do they end up having to absorb that loss, or is there some kind of legal recourse for them to get some of those loans back?
I think it is clear that there will be private sector involvement in defaults coming up. And if you look at, for instance, Republic of Congo got to a sort of debt restructuring deal with the IMF and China last year, where the Chinese essentially they agreed to extend 2/3 of their debt. Forget the exact sums. I think it was 1 or 2 billion. So it wasn't massive sums, definitely not for China. To defer or to extend the maturity of 2/3 of that debt by 15 years. And then Republic of Congo agreed that the remaining third, that they would repay that by the end of 2021, which is now looking pretty unlikely. But the problem with that deal, I mean, they did get a first IMF disbursement. They did get an IMF program and a first disbursement of funds. But then the program has essentially been on ice because the private creditors, in this case was Trafigura and Glencore, did not agree to the sort of write-downs of the debt that was kind of part of that deal. So I think that is quite significant. I think it shows that the problem with the debt relief is not going to be in China, I think, even though, of course, they need to work out the differences with the US and the rest of the G20. But with the private sector creditors. And I don't think, as I mentioned before, I don't think China and the G7 are really too far apart when it comes to the private sector involvement in any debt restructuring.
So there's no leverage over the private sector debt and the private creditor debt because the jurisdictions are so spread out. No one organization has it. And I think that's one of the difficulties that we're running into with this debt crisis, because back in the old days, in the 80s, for example, most of the debt was consolidated with international financial institutions, so the decisions could be made in London and Washington, and basta pasta, everything's done. Now, as you pointed out, gazillions of bondholders have to be, involved in any solution, and there's no compelling legal force, that, as far as I can see, that would bring a resolution to this. So where does that leave us? Let's close our discussion now in terms of what's the takeaway, because these African leaders for 6 months have been asking for the same thing and have made effectively no progress. As far as I know, the IMF is no closer to actually issuing a new special drawing rights, in part because, as you pointed out, there is this pressure in the United States to make sure that China and Iran and U.S. enemies like Venezuela don't get access to any special drawing rights, because when the IMF does an SDR, every single member of the IMF is granted money. So that makes it difficult on the SDRs. In terms of the $100 to $150 billion infusion that they've been asking for to help resolve the liquidity crisis, haven't heard anything on that. Meantime, European, American, Japanese, and Chinese governments have passed trillions of dollars of new stimulus. Where are we? What's going to happen here? Are these emerging markets in Africa and elsewhere just going to fall off a cliff and into the abyss, as Prime Minister Abayi warned?
No, there are going to be defaults. I think that is clear, but I wouldn't say that all countries are in a position where they're going to default. I mean, there are definitely countries that are in a relatively good position, that have the majority of their debt is from multilateral institutions, very low interest rates. And I mean, they're going to have to take a sort of economic pain, devalue their currencies. I think, very many African currencies are overvalued. You're going to have to devalue the currencies, improve your balance of payments on that way. And I think, there are, I mean, you say there's no leverage. I mean, it's very hard. I mean, that's a coordination issue. It's very difficult, well, impossible to get the coordination, get all these people into the same room as was possible with the multilateral debt relief in the early 2000 and in LATAM with the U.S. banks in the 1980s. But I think the outcome is you're going to have a deal. I think there is going to be some agreement. Parties are going to get together. The G20 summit in November is going to be interesting. I mean, that's after the US elections. So President Trump is still going to be there. The question is if he's an outgoing president or has been re-elected. I definitely think a Biden administration would be more conducive to have a sort of a deal with China and the rest of the G20 on a DSSI suspension or IMF new issuance of the SDR. So I think it's going to be drawn out. I think it's unlikely going to have a deal in G20 at the G20 summit in November. It's going to go out into the next year. I think the question now for a lot of these private sector creditors, well, I think it is going to be increasingly priced in that it's not just Zambia that's going to be in default. I personally think Ghana is in a very difficult situation. They haven't borrowed very much from China, but they borrowed very heavily in the Eurobond market. But I mean, it's going to be crystallized what countries are heading for a default. And I mean, some of these countries, most notably Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, did not apply for the DSSI suspension because they were still hoping to issue Eurobonds when the market settles. But I think that window is not going to reopen, and for countries that are, right on both, well, Ghana is running a fiscal deficit of almost 14% of GDP this year. I mean, most of it is going to be financed in the domestic market, but I mean, they essentially, if they don't have the access to the sort of Eurobond market, they're going to have to run a lot tighter fiscal policy. And that's going to be challenging, especially if you're heading into an election. I mean, now I think Ghana is quite clear they're going to tighten fiscal policy after the elections in December. But I think, they're already paying 50% of their government revenue in just to service the debt and the interest costs. So, so they're going to have to cut in other areas. It's going to be very challenging. I don't think the market has really priced this in adequately, and I think the question of seniority of debt is also going to come into the fore. That's something we've highlighted at Red. My colleague David Orbe-Graves has spoken more directly with the Eurobond holders and other commercial creditors, and their concern is that if these Chinese creditors, I mean, and some of them are actually have been lending on commercial terms, but if they are labeled as official bilateral creditors, they may participate in the DSSI, but it also means that their seniority is probably going to be ranked higher in any debt restructuring, and they're going to get more of their claims back than any commercial creditors. So that's also something that is going to come into focus. But I think it's going to be a drawn-out process into next year, and it's not going to be clear cut across the board.
It sounds like it's going to be long, drawn out, messy, complicated, and extremely painful for constituents. I mean, for African residents and citizens in many countries, including Zambia, Ghana, and others. That belt tightening you talk about doesn't sound like it's going to be very, very fun. So Mark Bohlund is the Senior Credit Research Analyst at Red Intelligence. He joins us from London. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain some of this for us. You know, we don't come from the asset management, private equity backgrounds and the private creditor background, so it's really helpful to get your insights on this. You are very active on Twitter. Where can people find you there?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, we could definitely talk about this for hours and hopefully be a bit wiser after it, but it's not a clear-cut situation. So definitely follow me on Twitter. We also have Red Intelligence, so drop me a message there if you're interested in. I published a report in early September, which I think is still very relevant to anyone who wants to get their head around that situation. So very happy to share that. So, and also LinkedIn and other forums. So please do get in touch if you're interested.
Okay, I'll double check and I'll make sure to put all of those links in the show notes. So if you want to follow Mark or get in touch with him about any of the things that we've discussed today, you'll be able to do so in the show notes. Once again, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it.
Many thanks. It was a pleasure.
Cobus, throughout the discussion with Mark, I just kept coming back to the same point in my head. I think so many African states are screwed. I mean, I can't get past the fact that here we are 6 to 8 months into this crisis, and these presidents and prime ministers are making the same appeals. And when Mark is kind of talking about the contraction in the economy, some countries will default, I think he's absolutely right. But I think he's speaking in very analytical terms, which is typical for the type of research that he does. But when we're talking about those contractions in the economy and some countries defaulting, that's an enormous amount of human pain, particularly at the moment when public health and social services budgets are running very, very low. And the fact that the United States and China, along with the international community, haven't been able to come up with the $100 to $150 billion is remarkable to me. We have yet to see any of this major cash infusion to resolve the liquidity crises. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that in a place like Washington, there just isn't the appetite to provide that type of liquidity out of concern that it will go to repay back Chinese loans. One has to think that the geopolitics are looming in the background of this. Otherwise, $100 billion in today's world is nothing. I mean, we're talking about the United States passing trillions of dollars of stimulus. Same in Europe, same in China, same in Japan. So $100 billion, if these countries wanted to come up with it, if they were motivated to come up with it, they certainly could. But you remember, we spoke with Vera Songwe from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, 2-3 months ago? And she was making that call back then? No progress. Again, it's why I think some countries are just going to get screwed, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, I think at the moment though, like I agree with you that I think a lot of countries are going to suffer a lot, and that suffering is obviously going to be visited on the breadth of the population, because this kind of belt tightening or austerity measures that will inevitably be called for will end up, impacting healthcare and social services and education and so on. So, yeah, I'm definitely very worried about that, but I do think that even if one looks at it through I think there's a compelling geopolitical argument to make for this support. I think at the moment, and we've made this point I think many times before, is that I think the Americans and the Europeans and some of the other players are they have a kind of a false perception of how isolated they are from Africa. And particularly the Europeans, I've kind of rung this bell several times, but I think the kind of level of instability this economic contraction is going to cause is definitely going to have impacts in Europe. Like it's definitely going to worsen the migration problem in Europe considerably. And I mean, Europe is already stretched on that, on dealing with that issue. It's gonna, I think, have a kind of a complicated double effect where, on the one hand, I think it's gonna actually entrench China's position in Africa. So if for kind of US kind of stakeholders, if that's what they're worried about, then this is going to worsen that situation, I think. And at the same time, it's going to significantly worsen the security situation in Africa, which is going to directly impact on US armed forces there. So I think the idea that all of this is happening far away from Europe, far away from the US, is an illusion. And that, I think, is something that doesn't seem to be breaking through to these leaders.
And this is the point that's been made by a number of different analysts, which is if they think $100 or $150 billion is expensive now, wait until we have the situations that you're talking about, which is mass migration from Africa across the Mediterranean into Southern Europe, which is failed states that will generate more presence of ISIS like we're seeing in northern Mozambique. And as you talked about rightly, the fact that this is going to open up new opportunities for the Chinese to expand their influence in Africa. I was thinking about this today when I was writing the newsletter, and there was a news piece that crossed that Hisense, that's the state-owned white goods maker and electronics manufacturer, they opened up, or they announced a plan to open up a new factory in South Africa, north of Cape Town, where they're going to hire 200 more people. I posted that on Twitter today, and the response was just overwhelming. I mean, there was so many people saying, this is what we need, this is great news, this is amazing. And it just shows that a small factory with 200 people in it, relatively small, can generate that much positive response that the geopolitical opportunities here for the country that understands how to do this could be enormous. And you've talked about this as well in your piece in Business Day, that these changes that we're seeing in the economic landscape may also lead to profound changes in the geopolitical arena as well.
Yeah, I think, and in the end, I think the real winner out of all of this will be China. Because it will end up, China already has so much leverage, through the amount of debt that it has. So kind of working out even minimally, kind of like softened versions of like deals, deals that where you kind of like make the landing even that little bit softer for African governments is going to end up actually really entrenching China in, kind of in the African landscape, because the rest of the world is made up by actors that are so disengaged with the continent at the moment, like the US and the UK, or this kind of myriad of kind of commercial actors, all of these, kind of Eurobond investors and so on, who either they don't really have a constituency, they don't really have, they're not located anywhere, they're kind of free floating in the air in weird ways, and and they don't care, kind of like generally, the economic health of Africa is one among many of their priorities and not a very high one. So compared to that, it's easy for the Chinese to play this as, kind of as we here to help, kind of, and in that kind of dire situation, that message could well land, So I think in the end, when the dust settles, I think is we're going to see considerably weakened Europe and US in Africa and a considerably entrenched China.
Two final points here before we go. Number one is that we have to remember that the amount of debt that China has in Africa, which is about $120 to $140 billion, I think that's the number, I forget it, but it's in that range. While it's a lot for each individual African country, for a $14 trillion economy like China's, this is insignificant. So you're right, Cobus, that China will have the leverage, it will take the time, it will renegotiate, it will push back the repayments of these debts, and it can afford to wait because, again, the amounts on a macro level are not that significant. The other point is you've been raising quite a bit in your writing, and we've talked about it a lot in our newsletter, this experimental deal that the Chinese did in Laos. And it's going to be an area that we continue to monitor. In fact, Cobus, I just found an expert today who studies Chinese state-owned enterprise deals in Laos. And I'm going to reach out to her to see if she can come on the show and we can talk to her about what's going on with the state-owned electric company in Laos to see if that is in fact a potential model for other markets around the world and why they chose Laos to do that first before everywhere else. So stay tuned. I'm looking for the guest, and I will try to bring her on the show. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. If you enjoy the topics that we talked about today, the deep dive that we did on debt, we would love to have you join our community of readers who subscribe to our daily email newsletter. Folks like Mark in the asset management space, the economic research sector, we have a lot of subscribers there in the United Nations, World Bank, the United States government, South African government, the Foreign Commonwealth Office. We're very proud that our readership is expanding in the diplomatic, political, and also in the analyst space as well, join us. It's only $3 for 3 months to try it out. See if you like it. Cobus and I put our hearts into it every single day. I spend about 12 hours a day putting this thing together, and would love to make sure that you give it a try. So go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Okay, that's it. We'll be back again next week with another show. So for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/ChinaAfricaProject to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at E. Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.